Racist guard blocks black woman from boarding private jet, but her identity shocks everyone. The California sun was slowly setting behind the glistening private terminals at Los Angeles International Airport as Emma Carter pulled up in her modest Honda Accord. At 38, Emma had achieved great success, yet she continued to maintain a simple lifestyle. Today, like usual, she chose to drive herself rather than use the company car. Emma glanced at her watch. 6:45 p.m. Her flight was scheduled for 7:30, giving her ample time to leisurely board her private jet and return to Atlanta after a demanding week of work. She grabbed her simple black suitcase from the trunk and her laptop bag, then walked briskly towards the private terminal. The evening air was cool and gentle, washing over her face and hands as she walked. Emma wore comfortable black slacks, a light blue blouse, and practical walking shoes. She always opted for clothing that was suitable for long flights, neat but comfortable. Her hair was neatly styled, and she wore only a small pair of pearl earrings. As she approached the terminal door, she smiled softly, reflecting on the journey she had made. 15 years ago, she was just a junior accountant at a small charter company. Now, she was the owner of Carter Aviation, one of the leading private jet charter companies, with a fleet of 35 aircraft and operations across 12 major cities. The security lights flickered on, casting a soft glow against the modern glass building. Emma glanced through the large window, seeing her company's newest Gulfstream G650 parked, with the Carter Aviation logo in deep blue standing out on the tail. It was a design she had personally chosen when she took over the company 5 years ago. Other passengers were making their way into the terminal, most of them in elegant suits carrying luxury luggage. A few had assistants to help with their baggage and paperwork. Emma noticed that some were greeted by the security staff who opened doors and offered assistance. Her phone buzzed in her laptop bag. A message from her mom asking if she would make it back in time for Sunday dinner. Emma quickly typed a reply as she continued walking. No matter how successful she was, she never missed Sunday dinner with her parents, eating her mom's famous fried chicken and sharing stories about her week. Emma walked past the parking lot filled with Mercedes, Bentleys, and Ferraris. Her Honda stood out among the luxury cars, but she didn't mind. Growing up in a working-class family, she knew the value of money and always chose to invest in her company and her employees rather than lavish material symbols. As she neared the entrance of the terminal, a blast of cool air from the air conditioning hit her face. Through the glass door, she noticed a new security guard, a man she hadn't met before. Emma reached for her ID and access card, following the security procedures she herself had put in place. She believed in treating everyone fairly and with respect, which included following the same rules she expected her employees to adhere to. A group of pilots in sharp uniforms passed by her, nodding politely without realizing she was their boss. Emma liked it that way. She always believed that true leadership wasn't about being recognized everywhere, but rather building a company that could run smoothly even when she wasn't around. The evening sky had turned a beautiful shade of purple and orange, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the terminal. Emma paused for a moment, her eyes drifting to the scene outside. Planes taking off and landing, engines rumbling softly in the distance, and ground staff busy at work. She took a deep breath, standing tall as she felt her passion for aviation rekindle with each small detail. Emma had no idea that in just a few minutes, her ordinary evening would take an unexpected turn. As she wheeled her suitcase to the security desk, she was about to face a situation that would test her patience and spark a nationwide conversation about prejudice and privilege in the aviation industry. John Davis stood behind the security desk, adjusting his freshly ironed uniform for what felt like the 10th time that hour. With just 2 weeks into his job at the private terminal, he was eager to impress his superiors. His eyes followed every well-dressed executive walking through the doors, offering extra smiles and attention to those arriving in luxury cars and carrying designer luggage. As Emma Carter approached the security desk, pulling her simple black suitcase, Davis's demeanor changed instantly. He straightened his back, his chin lifted slightly, his face assuming a stern expression. Before Emma could even reach for her ID, Davis raised his hand to stop her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Davis said loudly, his voice echoing through the quiet terminal. "The entrance for cleaning staff is on the other side of the airport." This is the private aviation terminal. His voice was carefully measured, his smile remained, but his eyes narrowed with clear disdain. Emma blinked, her hand pausing for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, looking straight into his eyes. "Actually, I'm here to board my flight," she said calmly, her hand rummaging in her laptop bag for her identification. "I can show you, ma'am," Davis interrupted, his voice growing louder, his hand extending again to block her path. "I've been working in security for years. I know very well how things operate here," he continued, his eyes following Emma's every move. But that was a lie. He had only been in the industry for 2 months, and this was his first position at an airport. "Cleaning staff must use the proper entrance. I can't allow you to wander around here, disturbing our important customers." A few passengers standing nearby began to turn their heads, some taking out their phones to record, while others whispered among themselves. A young businessman in an expensive suit smirked, the mockery evident. This reaction only spurred Davis on, making him feel even more powerful. Emma took a deep breath, her chest rising slightly, trying to keep her breathing steady. She tried again, her voice still gentle but firm. "Sir, I understand you're just doing your job, but I am a passenger. If you could just let me listen." Davis interrupted again, stepping out from behind the desk, his footsteps landing heavily, echoing through the space. "I don't want to have to call security, but if you don't leave right now, I won't have any other choice." His hand moved to his radio, his eyes locked onto Emma, clearly signaling a warning. A small crowd had now gathered. Emma noticed a few people shaking their heads. Her hand tightened slightly on the suitcase handle. She felt warmth rising in her cheeks, not out of embarrassment, but from the familiar restraint of having to stay calm in an unfair situation. "Is there a problem here?" An older woman in a pilot's uniform approached, her eyes assessing the situation seriously. She had been standing nearby, watching, and decided it was time to intervene. "Just maintaining security at the terminal," Davis replied, lifting his head with pride. "This woman claims to be a passenger, but clearly," he let the words trail off, shrugging as though implying something to the pilot, his gaze cold. The pilot raised an eyebrow, about to speak, but Emma raised her hand slightly, signaling that she would handle it herself. She stood taller, taking a breath, keeping her hands steady. She had faced prejudice before and knew exactly how she wanted to handle this, with calmness, patience, but without backing down. "Mr. Davis." Emma read his name from the badge on his chest, her voice steady, her breathing controlled. "I'm going to try one more time. I am here to board my flight. I have all the necessary identification. Would you like to check them, or do you want to continue escalating this situation?" Davis crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, inhaling deeply as if to assert authority. "Ma'am, I don't like your attitude. I know all of our regular passengers, and you are certainly not one of them. For the last time, please leave the terminal before I have to call in additional security." Emma noticed more phones were now recording the situation. She also spotted Mr. Harper, the terminal manager, striding quickly towards them from his office, his face tense, his eyes wide with recognition. But Davis, oblivious to Mr. Harper's approach, continued his monologue, his voice filled with condescension and contempt. "Maybe," Davis said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, his lips pressed tightly, "you're confused about where you need to be. This area is for private jet owners and their guests only. The main terminal," he never got to finish. Mr. Harper finally reached them, his breath quick, his eyes wide with alarm. The usually neat manager looked somewhat disheveled after his rushed trek across the lobby, almost knocking over a potted plant on his way. But before he could intervene, Davis decided to make the situation even worse. "I will call for backup right now," Davis declared, pulling out his radio in a showy manner. He pressed the button and spoke into it with a commanding voice. "Requesting security backup at the main entrance. We have a non-compliant individual refusing to leave the premises." His voice echoed through the terminal, creating a sudden silence. Emma stood there, her hand still holding her identification and company ownership papers. She could feel the dozens of eyes on her, the number of phones recording the incident growing rapidly. With a quick glance at a young man's screen, she saw him live streaming the entire scene on social media. "Sir," Emma tried once more, her voice still calm, her hand squeezing the documents lightly, while her other hand held tightly onto the suitcase handle. "If you would just look at my papers." "Step back," Davis ordered, his hand raised high in a forceful gesture. "Security is on the way. Any sudden moves, and I will have to take defensive action." He spread his legs, body tense, ready for confrontation. His overreaction made a few bystanders flinch, stepping back slightly. Two other security guards hurried over from different directions, their shoes squeaking on the polished tile floor. They looked confused as they approached, seeing Emma standing still, holding her suitcase, clearly not fitting the emergency description they were called in to handle. A well-dressed businessman in the crowd spoke up, his eyebrows furrowed, his face red with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Can't you see she's just trying to show you her identification?" A few others in the crowd nodded in agreement, while some continued holding their phones up, recording. Davis turned to the businessman, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched slightly, clearly displeased at being challenged. "Sir, I know how to do my job. This woman clearly doesn't belong here, and I am simply protecting our important customers." He emphasized the word important as he glanced at Emma, his gaze sharp and full of contempt. Emma saw Mr. Harper just a few steps away, his face tense, eyes wide with worry. She gave a small shake of her head, signaling him to wait. She wanted to see just how far Davis would push this situation. "Ma'am," one of the supporting security guards spoke, his voice more level and professional. "Could you please explain the situation?" He stood straight, looking at Emma, clearly willing to listen, unlike Davis. But before Emma could respond, Davis cut in again. "She claims she's a passenger, Johnson. Obviously, she's confused or trying to sneak in," Davis said, his chin lifted slightly, his face marked by arrogance. "I've never seen her before, and I know all the regulars here." He spoke with confidence, as if he'd been working here for a long time, even though it had only been 2 weeks. The crowd grew larger, whispers spreading across the terminal. Some people shook their heads, their expressions showing disapproval of Davis's behavior, while others were on their phones, likely reporting what they were witnessing. The terminal now resembled a stage, and this uncomfortable scene was playing out before an ever-growing audience. "I suggest," Davis continued, his lips curling into a smug grin, "that you leave now before we have to escort you out. And don't think about coming back with any fake papers. We can spot those easily." He tapped his security badge on his chest, though it was slightly crooked. Emma glanced quickly at her watch. Her flight was set to depart in just 30 minutes. She had planned to use the flight time to review some important documents, but instead, here she was, standing in her own terminal, being treated like a criminal. The young man live streaming suddenly spoke up, pointing to his phone screen. "Hey, this stream already has over 1,000 viewers. They're asking for the name of this terminal in the security company." Davis heard him, immediately standing straighter, puffing out his chest, clearly proud that his actions were being witnessed and, he assumed, praised by many. Mr. Harper finally arrived, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Davis," he began, his voice trembling, his hand half raised as if to interrupt. "Don't worry, sir," Davis interrupted, his eyes still fixed on Emma, not even turning to look at his manager. "I have the situation under control. I'm protecting our valuable clients from this person." He emphasized the last word with disdain, causing several people in the crowd to gasp. The next few moments would become some of the most viral footage of the year, as Davis was about to face a major lesson about the person he had been disrespecting for the past 15 minutes. Mr. Harper finally stepped between Davis and Emma, his face flushed with embarrassment, his gaze dropping awkwardly. "Mr. Davis," he said loudly, his voice clear to ensure everyone could hear, "I want you to meet Ms. Emma Carter, the owner and CEO of Carter Aviation, the company that owns this terminal and all 35 private jets in our fleet." A silence fell over the room, leaving everyone stunned, eyes wide with shock. Davis's face shifted through a series of emotions, surprise, disbelief, and then gradually paled. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The radio in his hand slipped to the floor, the impact echoing throughout the room. "Miss Carter," Mr. Harper continued, his voice trembling as he averted his eyes slightly. "I cannot fully express my apologies for this incident. Mr. Davis is new here, but that is no excuse for impossible." Davis suddenly burst out, his voice high-pitched with disbelief. "She can't be. I mean, I saw photos of Emma Carter in the company newsletter. She—" He trailed off, lips pressed tight, realizing that any further words would only make things worse. Emma calmly took out her ID, the company ownership documents, and her pilot's license, holding them up high for everyone to see. "These are the papers I've been trying to show you for the past 15 minutes, Mr. Davis," she said steadily, her voice even, without raising it. "Would you like to verify them now?" The crowd began to murmur, eyes moving between Emma and Davis. Some people who were recording quickly shared their videos. The young man live streaming raised his phone and announced loudly, "Guys, this is insane. The woman he's been trying to kick out is the owner of the entire company." A pilot, walking by, suddenly stopped, his eyes widening as he recognized Emma. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said, nodding respectfully, then shot an angry glare at Davis. "I hope everything is all right." The pilot was wearing the Carter aviation uniform, the same uniform that Emma herself had helped design. Davis felt his knees weaken, his body swaying slightly. He quickly grabbed the security desk to steady himself. The two security guards that Davis had called looked at each other before stepping back, trying to distance themselves from the scene. One of them swiftly removed his cap and bowed apologetically to Emma. "To Ms. Carter," Davis stammered, his lips dry, eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't know. I was just trying to, I thought." Sweat was beading on his forehead, dripping down his cheeks as he slowly realized the severity of his mistake. Emma raised her hand, palm facing outward, signaling for him to stop. "Mr. Davis, I've been trying to show you my identification since I arrived here. Instead, you chose to judge me solely based on my appearance. You made a decision without any evidence that I didn't belong here." Her voice was steady and clear, but each word weighed heavily, making Davis bow his head, his body shrinking as if trying to disappear. The businessman who had spoken earlier stepped closer, his fists clenched, eyes fixed firmly on Emma. "Ms. Carter, I'm Michael Brooks from Brighton Investments. What happened today is completely unacceptable. I would be happy to provide a statement about what I witnessed." Many other passengers stepped forward as well, offering their contact information and expressing their support. The terminal filled with noise, the buzz of people voicing their discontent about Davis's behavior and their admiration for Emma's calm demeanor throughout the ordeal. Mr. Harper stood nearby, holding his phone, his eyes darting nervously between people. His face reddened further as he paced back and forth, his legs restless, and occasionally he bowed his head apologetically to Emma while continuing his call, likely to headquarters. Emma glanced at her wristwatch, then turned back to the crowd, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you all for your concern and support. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch." She turned to Davis, who was still leaning against the desk, his hand gripping the edge as if fearing he'd collapse. "Mr. Davis, I suggest you be in my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. We have much to discuss regarding security protocols and customer service." As Emma moved toward the boarding gate, the crowd parted respectfully to let her pass. Many employees who recognized her nodded and greeted her warmly, their lips forming gentle smiles, while those who had never met her before watched her leave with a mixture of admiration and some embarrassment for how she had been treated. Davis stood frozen, his eyes following Emma as she walked away. He had just learned that the woman in front of him wasn't just his superior. She was the owner of the entire company. The radio lay on the floor, softly crackling as another security officer requested a status update, but no one bothered to answer. The video of this incident had already spread across social media, and Davis's world had just turned upside down. The next morning, Emma's office at Carter Aviation headquarters was bustling, phones ringing off the hook since the video of the incident went viral. The clips had amassed millions of views across social media platforms, with hashtags like hashtag Carter Aviation and hashtag discrimination in aviation trending everywhere. Emma sat at her desk, her eyes moving quickly over the hundreds of emails and messages. Some were from news channels asking for interviews, some from civil rights organizations offering support, and many messages shared similar experiences from viewers. Her assistant, Lisa, stepped in, holding a large stack of papers. "Miss Carter," Lisa said, placing the stack on the desk, her tone cautious. "Mr. Davis has arrived. He's been sitting in the lobby for the past 30 minutes, even though the meeting hasn't started yet." Lisa paused before adding, "He looks like he hasn't slept all night." Emma nodded, glancing at the clock on her desk. It was only 8:30 a.m. "How's the situation outside?" she asked. "There are 3 news vans parked across the street," Lisa replied, her eyes shifting toward the window. "Social media is still buzzing. The video has been shared by several celebrities, and people are demanding Mr. Davis be fired immediately." In the lobby, John Davis sat anxiously, his fingers fidgeting as he kept adjusting his tie. He hadn't slept at all the night before. His phone had been going off nonstop with messages from friends and family, all of whom had recognized him in the viral video. His sister had called, her voice shaky, asking why he could behave like that. Even his mother had left a disappointed voicemail, saying they needed to talk. The terminal manager, Mr. Harper, stepped into Emma's office, his demeanor tense, his steps heavy. "Ms. Carter, our PR team has drafted a statement for the company, but they need your approval before releasing it." He handed her a folder. "Also, the security company has sent their executive to meet you. They're ready to terminate Mr. Davis immediately." Emma took the PR statement, reading through it for a moment before setting it aside. She pressed the intercom button. "Lisa, please send Mr. Davis in now." The door opened, and Davis stepped in. His shoulders slumped, his steps slow. The confidence from the previous day was completely gone. He held his security badge in his hand, which was trembling slightly, and his face was pale. Mr. Harper made a motion to leave the room, but Emma signaled for him to stay. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Davis," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her desk. Davis sat down cautiously, his back hunched slightly, as if afraid the chair might not support him. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know saying sorry is not enough, but I am truly sorry." He swallowed hard, his eyes avoiding direct contact with Emma's. "All night, I've been thinking about my actions, and I feel ashamed of the way I behaved. I understand if you want to fire me." In fact, his voice broke, and he pulled out an envelope with a shaky hand. "I've prepared my resignation letter." Emma sat silently, observing Davis for a few moments, her gaze never leaving him. After a while, she spoke. "Mr. Davis, do you know why I drove a Honda to the terminal yesterday? Instead of a luxury car? Why I carried my own bags and wore comfortable clothes instead of expensive designer brands?" Davis frowned, confused, and shook his head slightly. "Because I believe that a person's character and actions are more important than their appearance," Emma continued, her tone steady. "I grew up in a working-class family in Atlanta, and my parents taught me to judge people by how they treat others, not by what they own or how they look." Emma looked directly at Davis, her eyes unblinking. "Unfortunately, yesterday, you did the exact opposite." The meeting room fell into silence, with only the ticking of the clock echoing steadily. Through the window, Emma could see another news van parking in front of the building. "The easiest thing I could do is accept your resignation or fire you," Emma said, lifting the PR statement from her desk. "That would certainly satisfy everyone who's angry on social media." She leaned forward, looking directly at Davis. "But let me ask you, Mr. Davis, would that actually solve anything?" Davis raised his head, his eyes widening in confusion. He had thought he would be immediately fired, perhaps even escorted out by security, experiencing the humiliation that he had inflicted on someone else. But instead, Emma Carter was asking him a question he never expected, a question that could change not only his career but also how he viewed his life. The next few minutes of this meeting would not make it onto social media, would not become a viral video or a sensational headline. But what followed would lead to profound changes, not just for Carter Aviation, but for the entire private aviation industry. Emma leaned forward, her gaze steady on Davis. Instead of firing you, I want to share something with you. She opened her desk drawer and took out an old, slightly frayed photograph. This picture was taken 15 years ago, on my first day working in aviation. Davis hesitated, then took the photograph from Emma's hand. It was a picture of a young Emma, standing tall, smiling proudly in front of a small charter plane. She was wearing a simple uniform, with a badge reading trainee accountant. During my first week on the job, Emma continued, her eyes on Davis, her voice slow and deliberate. A client refused to give me financial documents because he didn't believe I was really an accountant. He asked to see the real accountant 3 times before my manager convinced him that I was capable. Mr. Harper shifted uncomfortably in his chair next to them, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. Meanwhile, Davis continued to stare at the photograph, his hands clutching it tightly, trembling slightly. Over the years, Emma went on, her voice even, I've often been mistaken for a janitor, a flight attendant, or even a lost passenger. I've been asked to make coffee in meetings I was leading. There have been times when people refused to believe I was a pilot, even after I showed them my license. Emma stood up, slowly walking towards the window, her eyes gazing outside at the news van still parked there. Her arms hung loosely by her sides. What happened yesterday isn't new to me, Mr. Davis. The only new thing is that, for the first time, someone recorded it on video. Davis held the photo, his hands trembling, his lips pressed tightly together. He lowered his head, quickly wiping his eyes with his sleeve. I don't know what to say, Ms. Carter. I never thought. I didn't realize. His voice broke, struggling to finish the sentence. Exactly. Emma turned back to face Davis, her eyes piercing into his, her voice firm. You didn't think. You only saw what you wanted to see, based on prejudices and assumptions that you might not even realize you had. Emma returned to her desk and pressed the intercom button. Lisa, please bring in the training proposal. Lisa entered, carrying a thick stack of documents, placing them carefully on Emma's desk. The cover read, Carter Aviation Inclusive Excellence Program. Mr. Davis, Emma said, opening the file and flipping through a few pages. I spent most of last night working on this instead of sleeping. This is the new training program I want to implement at all of our terminals, and I want you to help develop it. Davis looked up, his brows slightly furrowed, clearly taken aback by the offer. Mr. Harper also leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with interest. This program will include real-world scenarios, personal stories from industry experts, and specific guidelines to avoid biases in security processes, Emma explained, her eyes never leaving Davis. Your experience, and more importantly, your mistake, can help prevent others from making the same assumptions. Emma took out several sheets of paper, placed them on the desk, and gently pushed them toward Davis. Instead of accepting your resignation, I am giving you a choice. You can leave this job, and the incident will follow you forever on social media. Or you can stay, help us develop this program, and turn your mistake into a lesson for others. Davis wiped his eyes with his sleeve once more, taking a deep breath. You still trust me after everything I did to you? He looked at Emma, his eyes filled with confusion. Sometimes, Emma replied, her voice warm but firm. The best teachers are those who learn from their own mistakes. What you did yesterday was wrong, but your response today shows me that you understand that. The question now is, what will you do with this understanding? Mr. Harper spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but full of empathy. This program could really make a difference, not just here but across the entire industry. Emma nodded, looking at Davis, and gently pushed a pin toward him. We'll start with our terminals, and then expand to others. She handed Davis a pin and another set of documents, her eyes locking onto his. This is your new contract. Instead of continuing as an ordinary security officer, you'll be part of the training team. You'll need to complete diversity and inclusion training yourself first, and then help us develop and implement this program. It won't be easy. Some people will criticize this decision, but I believe everyone deserves the chance to learn and grow. Davis stared at the contract, his eyes moving between the papers and Emma. He gripped the pin lightly, feeling the weight of the moment. Outside the window, another news van was pulling up. unaware that the story they were chasing had taken a completely unexpected turn. "The choice is yours, Mr. Davis," Emma said, her voice gentle but resolute. "What will you decide?" The next few minutes would decide not only John Davis's future, but also potentially change how private aviation terminals across the country handled security and customer service. The pin in his hand felt heavier than any security badge he had ever worn. 3 months after the incident, the main training room at Carter Aviation headquarters looked very different from a typical workspace. The walls were covered with powerful photos and stories of diversity in the aviation industry, many of which were personal experiences shared by employees. At the front of the class, John Davis stood before 20 new security officers. His stance was confident but not arrogant. "I want to show you something," Davis said, holding up a remote control. He pressed a button, projecting the now famous video of his confrontation with Emma Carter onto a large screen. A few of the new recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they saw the clip they had already viewed on social media. "This is me, 3 months ago," Davis continued, his voice steady but serious. "I am not proud of this moment, but I show it at the start of every training session because it's important for you to see just how easily unconscious biases can influence our behavior." The door at the back of the room opened quietly, and Emma Carter entered. She stood silently at the back, observing. None of the trainees noticed her arrival, as they were fully focused on Davis's story. "That day, I thought I was doing my job correctly," Davis explained, pausing the video and looking around the room. "I thought I knew what private jet owners looked like. I thought I knew who fit in and who didn't, but I was completely wrong, and that mistake taught me the most valuable lesson of my career." He clicked to the next slide, projecting statistics about diversity in the aviation industry today. 30% of Carter Aviation's senior management are women, and 25% are people of color. We have pilots, engineers, and owners from all sorts of backgrounds, but those numbers don't tell the full story. Emma smiled from the back of the room as she watched Davis confidently and responsibly lead the presentation she had helped him develop. The training program was now in its 3rd month and had already trained more than 200 security officers across various terminals. "Last week," Davis continued, his eyes lighting up, "I encountered a situation where a young woman in jeans and a t-shirt approached the security desk. 3 months ago, I might have made assumptions about her. Instead, I followed the new procedures. I greeted her respectfully, checked her identification properly, and provided professional service regardless of her appearance." He smiled softly, looking down briefly before meeting the class's eyes again. It turned out she was a 19-year-old tech entrepreneur who had just sold her startup for millions of dollars. "She told me that our security team was the most professional she had ever encountered. That's what this training program is all about, treating everyone with equal respect and dignity." The training room had transformed significantly over the past 3 months. From a simple classroom, it had become an interactive learning space. One wall featured the wall of bias, where trainees shared their experiences with prejudice they had encountered. Another wall displayed thank you letters from passengers who had noticed positive changes in the security procedures. Davis moved on to the practical part of the training session. "Now, let's role-play a few scenarios," he said, his voice clear and authoritative. "Remember, our job is to maintain security while treating everyone with respect. It's not about lowering standards, but about applying them equally to everyone." Emma stood at the back, observing as Davis handled the simulated scenarios. His manner in guiding each trainee, correcting mistakes gently but decisively, showed his experience and sense of responsibility. The video that once nearly ended his career had now become his most powerful teaching tool in this classroom. During the break, a new recruit approached Davis, his eyes showing a mix of hesitance and determination. "Sir, I watched that video when it first went viral. I never thought I'd have the chance to be trained by you, but this program, it's really opened my eyes." Davis nodded, placing a gentle hand on the young trainee's shoulder, his eyes thoughtful. "That's exactly what happened to me," he said slowly. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to the most important lessons, if we are willing to learn from them." Finally, Emma stepped forward, greeting everyone, drawing attention to herself. The trainees immediately stood straighter, their eyes focused on her with respect. They recognized her from the video and the company's materials. However, instead of the tension of 3 months ago, the room was now filled with mutual respect and understanding. "Mr. Davis," she spoke warmly, her eyes meeting his, "I hear that our training program will be adopted by 3 other major aviation companies next month." Davis couldn't hide his joy, his eyes lighting up. "That's right, Ms. Carter. They've seen the improvement in our security metrics and customer satisfaction, and they want to implement similar training at their terminals." Emma looked around the room, her gaze resting on the focused faces of the new trainees. She knew that her decision 3 months ago had been the right one. That incident could have ended in anger and dismissal, but instead, it had sparked a movement for positive change within the aviation industry. The next phase of the program would expand even further, but at this moment, seeing Davis teach with passion and understanding was proof enough that people can change and help others change. 6 months after the viral incident, Emma Carter stood on stage at the National Aviation Industry Conference in Chicago. The large auditorium was packed with over 500 industry leaders, all eager to hear her keynote speech about transforming workplace culture in aviation. As she looked down at the audience, Emma noticed John Davis sitting in the front row, dressed smartly in a suit and wearing his Carter Aviation Training Coordinator badge. Beside him sat Mr. Harper, now the head of the company's Diversity and Inclusion program. Both men smiled, nodding encouragingly at her. 6 months ago, Emma began, her voice clear and powerful. "A video went viral showing me being denied access to my own private jet terminal." A murmur swept through the audience as people recognized the story. "Today, I'm not here to talk about that moment of discrimination," she continued firmly. "I'm here to talk about what happened afterward, and how one incident sparked a revolution in aviation security training." She clicked the remote, bringing up the first slide on the big screen. Charts and figures appeared. Since implementing the Excellence in Inclusion program, passenger complaints about security procedures have dropped by 70% across all our terminals. Customer satisfaction has increased by 45%, but the most impressive figure is 0. Emma paused, looking at the audience. "That's the number of discrimination-related incidents reported at any Carter Aviation facility in the past 5 months. The entire auditorium erupted into applause, the sound echoing throughout the hall. Davis sat in the front row, his head held high, his back straight, pride evident on his face. Emma continued, "But numbers only tell part of the story. The real change is in people's attitudes and understanding. And to illustrate that, I'd like to invite a special person to join me on stage." She turned to the front row where Davis sat. "Mr. John Davis, would you come up to the stage, please?" Davis looked momentarily surprised, but quickly stood up, adjusting his suit as he made his way confidently to the stage. A few members of the audience whispered to each other, recognizing him from the infamous video. However, instead of shame, Davis walked with the confidence of someone who had learned, grown, and was now ready to help others do the same. Emma looked toward the audience, gesturing toward Davis. "Mr. Davis was the security guard in that viral video," she said clearly, articulating each word. "Today, he leads the training program that has certified over 500 security personnel across the country. Mr. John, would you like to share your perspective?" Davis stepped forward, gripping the microphone in front of him, taking a deep breath before beginning. 6 months ago, I was the perfect example of everything wrong with private aviation security." He looked around the auditorium, his gaze resting on the attentive faces. "Today, I'm proud to be part of the solution." His voice was steady, without a quiver, as if every word he spoke carried weight and value. "Ms. Carter could have fired me, but instead, she showed me how to turn a mistake into a mission." Emma returned to the lectern, clicking to the next slide. Photos of aviation professionals from diverse backgrounds appeared on the screen. She gestured towards the images. "Change doesn't always come from firing or public shaming. Sometimes the most powerful change comes from giving people the opportunity to learn and grow," she said, her voice strong yet warm. "Our industry is changing, our passengers are changing, and our approach to security and service must change with them." The presentation continued as Emma announced the nationwide rollout of the Excellence in Inclusion program. She emphasized that 10 major aviation companies had already signed up to adopt the training, with many others showing interest. As the speech ended, a crowd gathered around Emma to congratulate her. She shook hands and exchanged words of thanks. Suddenly, she noticed a young black woman in the crowd, standing patiently, clutching her hand back. The girl looked to be in her early 20s, her eyes filled with determination. As the crowd began to thin out, the young woman stepped forward. "Miss Carter," the girl said, her voice slightly trembling, her hands clasped together. "I'm a student at a flight academy. When I saw that video 6 months ago, I almost quit because I thought there was no place for someone like me in aviation." She paused, looking directly into Emma's eyes. "But then I followed your story and saw how you turned it into something positive. You showed me that we can change things from the inside." Emma smiled gently, her gaze softening, and reached into her bag to pull out a business card. She scribbled something on the back and handed it to the girl. "This is my personal email. When you graduate, send me your CV. Carter Aviation is always looking for pilots who understand the importance of breaking down barriers." As the conference came to a close, Emma stood with Davis and Harper, all three gazing out of the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline. Private jets were continuously taking off and landing at the nearby airport, their flight paths weaving across the dimming evening sky. "You know," Davis said, his eyes following each plane, his voice low and contemplative, "that day at the terminal could have been the worst day of my life, but instead, it became the most important day." Emma nodded, her hand lightly touching the window frame as she watched the flight paths. "Sometimes the worst moments can lift us, and others, to new heights. We just have to be willing to take the first step towards change." The three of them watched as the planes gradually disappeared into the darkening sky, knowing their work was far from over. But with what they had already accomplished, they had proven that even in the toughest of moments, positive change could emerge, not just for one individual, but for an entire industry. Thank you for watching and supporting our channel. If you enjoyed this inspirational story, don't forget to follow us to discover more meaningful stories. Wishing you happiness and peace.